Everything that woman wanted was someone who would obey in silence. But what she received was a lesson in humanity she would never forget. Because sometimes, what arrives as possession reveals itself as purpose. On the wide veranda of the mansion, surrounded by white columns and an undeniable view of privilege, the elderly woman sat with the posture of someone who had seen everything, conquered everything, and expected nothing more. Her bony fingers held a porcelain teacup, while her eyes, cold as marble, watched the gate open. A black woman with a steady gait crossed the garden carrying a little girl in her arms. It was uncommon to see someone walking with such dignity in that place, especially after the way she had been hired. In truth, she had been bought. Legally, of course, as a full-time domestic worker with lifelong exclusivity, which was just a polished modern way of saying she now belonged to that house, that lady, those rules. No personal documents, no salary, no right to leave. Everything agreed upon through an exploitation agency disguised as charity, with a seal of international discretion. The elderly woman saw no issue. She thought she was doing a favor to herself and to the world. She needed someone to care for her orphaned granddaughter, someone who wouldn't talk too much, who knew her place. She had had many caregivers before, but none lasted. That child was impossible. She never smiled, never spoke, ate little, woke up at night screaming names no one knew. Since her mother died in a car accident and her father fled to Asia with a violinist, the girl was a small shadow with eyes like rain. But when the woman entered that house for the first time, something different happened. It wasn't just that she didn't lower her eyes when introduced. It was her silence. A silence not born of fear, but of waiting, as if she knew that place had no idea who had just arrived. The girl at first reacted as always, indifferent, with limp arms and a vacant stare. But unlike the other caregivers, this woman didn't try to force conversations or coax the child to smile. She simply stayed. And little by little, she gained ground through the simple power of being there. Every night of nightmares she appeared before the crying began. Every meal, she knew exactly what the girl would eat without getting sick. And even without saying much, she made everything around her feel calmer, as if she carried a secret map to the voids of that house. The elderly woman, however, remained skeptical. She watched from a distance. The woman seemed too good, too silent, too efficient. She didn't trust people who asked for nothing, and there was something unsettling about the way she touched things, with respect, as if she weren't a servant, but a guardian, as if she knew the story of every piece of furniture, every portrait. And one day, she did something that marked the beginning of a rupture. She sat in the library at night and read to the girl. She read without asking permission. The granddaughter slept for the first time without screaming. When the elderly woman found out she had cameras installed, she began watching the footage at night in secret. She wanted to find flaws, abuses, lies, but the more she watched, the more confused she became. The woman never complained, never ate before feeding the child, never slept before ensuring everything was in order. And strangest of all, sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she cried. She cried looking at an old photograph in the guest room, one that no one else noticed. The elderly woman decided to confront her. "Whose photo is that?" she asked one night, standing on the staircase, watching the woman clean the windows. The response was calm, but left a chilling echo. "It's of someone who suffered in this house, but had no voice." The elderly woman, furious, threatened to fire her, to send her away with no rights, forgetting for a moment that she didn't even have those rights. But the woman only lowered her head and replied, "You can send me away, but that child will start screaming again." That was when the structure began to crack. In the days that followed, the elderly woman started investigating. She dug through old documents, forgotten records. She discovered that the photo was of a former maid who had died there decades ago under mysterious circumstances, a black woman, illiterate, whose name was never mentioned. But the new woman, how did she know? The answer came in the form of a letter, handwritten, left on the girl's bed. The child began to speak, whispering phrases from the letter. The elderly woman, shaken, asked the woman to explain, and for the first time she spoke. Not everything, just enough. She said she came from far away, that her grandmother had worked in that house, had been humiliated, silenced, buried without a name, that she, the granddaughter, had sworn that one day she would set foot there, not for revenge, but for healing. And when the chance appeared, even in the most absurd form as a disguised purchase, she accepted, because there was something in that child that cried out for the same liberation her grandmother never had. The elderly woman didn't respond. She simply left the room and locked herself in her bedroom for 2 days. When she emerged, she was different. She sat at the table with her granddaughter and asked the woman to sit as well. For the first time, the gesture seemed simple. But in that world it was a revolution. The days that followed felt suspended in another time. The mansion, once echoing with curt orders, distant footsteps and stifled sighs, now whispered small miracles in every corner. The girl began to laugh. Not often, nor loudly, but with those short, muffled laughs as if she were testing life. And the woman, now sitting at the table, though still not eating, became a living presence, no longer a shadow of a role. The elderly woman watched it all with an uncomfortable mix of fascination and resistance. She wasn't used to losing control, much less to feeling smaller than someone she deemed inferior. But there was something about that woman that eroded her certainties. An elegance not of etiquette but of essence. A gaze that, though gentle, knew how to measure the weight of silences. The elderly woman began to have insomnia. She would get up at night to walk the corridors, as if searching for an escape from her own history, until one early morning she heard a soft song coming from the girl's room. An old song, African, and for some reason she began to cry. The next morning there were no words, just an envelope on the table. Inside, an old yellowed newspaper clipping. Maid dies in accidental fire. Employers were not present. The deceased's name, Miriam, the woman's grandmother. And beside the clipping, an even older photograph. Miriam holding a white baby with a golden brooch on her dress, the same brooch the elderly woman had once found at the bottom of a drawer and never knew where it came from. She understood in that moment that there were inheritances beyond property. There were buried stories that, when unearthed, carried a silent judgment. And that judgment was alive, breathing in the woman she had bought, thinking she was acquiring silent labor, but in reality receiving the soul of a memory. The days passed with a kind of undeclared truce. The woman continued her work, but now with presence. The girl continued to improve, to speak, to draw, and one day wrote a name on a piece of paper. Mima. The elderly woman asked what it meant. The girl replied without hesitation, "It's her name. It's how she sings to me." That was when the elderly woman realized it was too late to keep the barriers standing. Because when a child names what heals her, the world must listen. The woman, now called Mima by the girl, began receiving visits from the gardener, the cook, the seamstress. People from the house once distant started seeking her advice, listening to her stories, learning words not found in books. She taught simple things: how to respect the timing of plants, how to deal with pains that have no remedy, how to listen to the eyes of others. And without realizing it, she became a reference, a mirror, a root, an emotional center of gravity that held the mansion together more than any walls. But not everyone accepted it. One of the elderly woman's sons, who lived in another state, came to visit one day. Arrogant, a company owner, with gestures that measured people like he measured profits. Upon seeing Mima sitting at the table with his mother and niece, he didn't hide his contempt. "What is she now, part of the family?" he asked with irony. The elderly woman stared at him, long and slow. Then she said only, "She's the only one who hasn't betrayed us." The silence that followed was like a muffled earthquake. The son left that same day, furious, but he left something behind. An old will, forgotten among the papers he had brought. In it, a name had been crossed out, that of the woman who had cared for the elderly woman for years, and then mysteriously disappeared. And another name had been added by hand, Miriam. The elderly woman, trembling, took the paper to Mima. "Was this your grandmother's?" she asked, almost voiceless. Mima looked. She touched the name as if caressing a wound, and replied, "It was hers, but it was never respected. Until now." That night, the elderly woman gathered all the household staff. In silence, she handed Mima a folder. Inside were her new documents: full name, recognized nationality, signed work contract, bank account, and with it, a letter written in her own hand. "You are not mine. You never were. But I am yours, because you made me see what I was, what I allowed and what I need to fix. Forgive me if you can, and allow me to call you a friend." Mima read the letter slowly, in silence, and at the end, she said nothing. She only touched the elderly woman's hand, which now trembled not from age but from regret. The gesture was enough. The next day, something changed forever. The girl, who always drew houses and trees, made a new drawing. It was a staircase, climbing to a blue sky. At the top were 3 figures: a child, a woman with braids, and an elderly woman holding flowers. When asked what it was, she replied, "It's when we climb," after saying sorry. The image was framed in the living room. Where there had once been a stern portrait of the elderly woman's late husband, now hung the granddaughter's drawing. The house finally had a new center, but the greatest transformation was yet to come, and it would come from outside. One morning, a social worker arrived at the house. It was part of an unexpected audit regarding old complaints of labor akin to slavery. The complaint had been anonymous, but too detailed to ignore. The elderly woman, who would have once hidden documents, now handed them over with bare hands. She spoke with a firm voice. "If you want to speak with the woman who was once called property, she's in the garden, teaching my granddaughter to plant an orange tree seed." The agent approached warily, clipboard in hand, tone neutral, but it took only a glance at Mima and the girl kneeling in the dirt, smiling with muddy hands and bright eyes, for something to disarm in the atmosphere. Still, she asked her questions: where she slept, what she ate, if she received a salary, if she had documents. Mima answered everything with firmness and serenity. She told her story, omitting no pain, but also holding no resentment. When she finished, the agent was silent. She closed her clipboard slowly and before leaving said, "Your story won't be filed away. It will be studied." That same week, an envelope arrived at the house. It was from the National Foundation for Historical Reparation. Inside was a letter signed by a judge, an official apology on behalf of the state, acknowledging that Mima's grandmother had been a victim of omission, abuse, and systematic erasure. And more, they offered the family the right to name a memorial in the city's historical archive. The elderly woman read the letter aloud, and for the first time in her life, she cried in front of everyone. Mima declined the position, the title, the name on plaques. She said her grandmother's story didn't need a showcase. It needed continuity. Instead, she asked that the house create a community library with accessible books and courses for marginalized women. The elderly woman agreed without hesitation. And more, she donated part of her inheritance to it. The space was named Miriam in simple letters on a wooden plaque. Nothing gilded, just true. The granddaughter grew up. She studied music, inspired by the songs Mima hummed on the nights she was still afraid of the dark. And at her graduation performance, in front of a full audience, she dedicated her presentation to "The woman who taught me to breathe without fear." It was a cello solo, the same music her mother, the elderly woman's daughter, had heard on the radio moments before the accident. The same melody that seemed to haunt the house for years, and now, at last, became a bridge between generations. The elderly woman aged with more lightness. She no longer shouted, no longer commanded. She asked, she advised, and she listened. One day, while walking through the garden hand in hand with her granddaughter, she sat on the bench under the orange tree and said, "If one day I'm no longer here, you know where to find me." The girl replied, "In the earth and in Mima's letters." It was exactly so. When she passed, the house didn't feel empty. Mima stayed, not out of obligation, but by choice. She became the girl's legal guardian, by a decision recorded in a notary and written in her own hand. "I trust this woman more than any blood heir." At the funeral, few people were present. Distant family, lawyers, the curious. But what stood out was the coffin covered with a handmade quilt. Embroidered with phrases the elderly woman had learned from Mima. "Silence gives consent. All earth has memory. Inheritance is what you heal, not what you leave." And there was a letter, read by the granddaughter with a trembling voice. "Dear girl, if I could go back in time, I would start by listening to you. I would have asked for forgiveness in time. I would have loved more lightly, demanded less. But God, in His mercy, sent me a woman who broke my walls with silence and made her silence a hymn. To you both I leave my house not as property, but as a promise. Make it a place where no one needs to hide. With love, grandmother." On the last page of the letter was a drawing, shaky but recognizable, a staircase, the same staircase the granddaughter had drawn as a child. Only now, there was one more figure at the top, a woman with braids holding an open book. And below, written in faltering handwriting, "Thank you for giving me back the name I never knew I lost." By the grave, Mima planted an orange tree. She placed there the first seed that had sprouted with the girl, and said only, "Now it is complete." The camera would pull back if this were a film. Slowly rising, it would show the mansion, now with livelier walls, the library with open doors, the child watering flowers, and the woman with braids sitting in silence, as if guarding time and planting the future with her own hands.